So welcome again. What are requirements? That is the topic that we're gonna discuss about uh, today. The requirements refers to the description of what the system should do and the services that it should provide. But this is not the only definition of requirements. It also means that any kind of limitations, any kind of constraints that you have on the system is also a requirement for you because it is defined in this very step. Such as if you are designing a mobile application that is going to be no way available to the PC platform, to the desktop platform, that is a requirement for you because you are specifically going onto the mobile and the needs of the mobile platform is quite different than the PC environment. So hence why you have to adjust your requirements according to that. Assume that you're going to develop a game for mobile platform and you are going to support it through some kind of business model so that you will establish this game and earn money from it. If you are going specifically for the mobile platform, the way that you develop this interactive media is so much more different than the way that you develop it on a desktop environment. Because first of all, the mobile platform has much more limitations instead of hardware compared to a regular computer. And second of all, the way that mobile industry runs is also different than how we download softwares for our PC. Majority of the mobile applications today, they rely on microtransactions and advertisements, where in the PC platform, this is not necessarily the case. It could be a different source or stakeholder that is supporting it. So basically, by making that decision, by making the constraint for your system, you are also defining a specific requirement for you. Because with that requirement, going exclusively for mobile platforms will change your business model. This is why most people assume that requirements are what the system should do and it stops there, but it is actually much more than that. It is the services, also the constraints of the system. Depending on the software process model that you select, a requirement can be an abstract statement or it can be a formal documentation. Now, this is where the documentation parts kick in. In some projects, you do a formal documentation because the project needs a hierarchy, a workflow, a structure to be followed, where in other cases, these are simply on board, where they form of user stories, such as the user will go there, click in there, and then another screen will be opened up. So the format of the requirements might change according to the project. What is requirements engineering? Requirement engineering is the process of establishing this very thing, the services, what the system should do, and its limitations. So basically, these can be defined as the system services, what the system can actually perform, and the limitations. Unfortunately, requirements is a process that often misunderstood. It is a process that it doesn't really establish in the many companies. It's not doesn't have a very strict structure, so it is a step that is often skipped or combined with other steps. Hence, it results a lot of problems. You might have seen this picture somewhere else as well, and it requires actually why it is very, very important. It could be that the customer needs a functioning product that will be simple enough, but they can go overboard. They can be too ambitious about it. And this can be interpreted by the designers and developers, even the programmers, by completely differently. Okay. So this is a very nice picture that shows why requirement is important. Because it's a subject that can easily be misunderstood. One of the big problems in the industry is that what the customer needs is often assumed rather than doing a proper research. people assumes and follows their instinct, follow what they actually need, and this is not necessarily meeting with the what the customer requires. And you can see this in many businesses, such as especially on the Mac platform. In the last 10 years, Apple changed their strategy so much that it doesn't fit into their old audience right now. So Apple used to produce computers that were really kind of like a niche, kind of very small community, but they would endure for years and they will address to that specific customer needs. Nowadays, Apple gone so big, so vast that their business model doesn't fit into their old agenda. And I can say the same thing for Microsoft. I used to dislike Microsoft and the way that they treated their platforms, the way that they treated their programming environments and everything. Now I think Microsoft in IT business is one of the best companies out there. I used to dislike C Sharp and favor Java. Now it's probably the opposite. I like C Sharp more and I don't like Java that much. It is because the Oracle company, they don't really understand what their customer needs, and because of their license issues, they are holding Java back. And so Java is actually a language, a programming environment that is reducing in popularity. It is losing its popularity, decreasing because of the company doesn't understand the requirements of other companies for using this language environment, and it works on a virtual machine, and it's not really addressing the needs. And because they went into a huge debate with Google, it is creating a lot of problems. Where when you look at the Microsoft, they have done completely the opposite. They have gone open source in many of their platforms. They are supporting they have a big support now on Linux environment. They even made their Visual Studio one of their programs, one of the big programs of theirs, and available for all platforms, not only for Microsoft Windows, but also on Mac and Linux. And people started to use it more often. There's a big community out there. So understanding what your customer requirements are is a key issue, because then you can address these customer requirements and you can basically move on with the project and form a community to back you up. Because of the greed of the companies, however, or because of other issues in their hierarchy, this is a subject that is often misinterpreted. Can you all hear me, by the way, when I talk? Is it clear, the subject?
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Let's go on. So there are a couple of requirements that I kind of like go into a different direction with the book. I'm not quite sure how many of you are reading the book, but in the book, it will basically talk about user system requirements, and underneath functional and non-functional requirements, I think it will also mention domain requirements under non-functional. However, I disagree with this. I like to take the domain requirements as a separate uh, thing, as a separate category, because their functionality, their presence doesn't really affect. They could be listed under non-functional requirements, but they are external requirements. They are not necessarily in your control. So I would like to take them on a different subject. So there are three main types of requirements: user requirements, system requirements, and domain requirements. And then each of these requirements themselves can be divided as functional and non-functional. Okay, this is the part that I go away a little bit from the book discussion. But in the book, you will see basically user system requirements, and every one of these will also be functional and non-functional. In addition to book, I added a new category called domain requirements. The user requirements refer to high-level abstract requirements. These are the requirements that are not specifically defined. They are at a very high abstract level, which means they need to be broken down in order to be analyzed further. An important part of user requirements is that they are very useful to managers or people who do not specifically understand from software engineering, but they still need to grasp an idea of what are the requirements for this project. It is possible that a software project can be managed by a person who doesn't have a background in software engineering. Maybe they have a very good background in project management, but they do not necessarily understand from programming or coding. It is possible. So in those circumstances, the user requirements can serve quite well to those people because they needs to be broken down obviously to generate system requirements, but they hide a lot of detail, hence why they are abstract. They hide a lot of detail that those people do not have to engage with. As a matter of fact, every single requirement is essentially broken down into system requirements. So system requirements actually they come from user requirements. And the system requirements are detailed descriptions of what the system should do. So in here now, the user requirements are broken down and generated into detailed system requirements, which can be useful to the developers themselves. User requirements are written in a natural language or in diagrams. These can be user stories or user diagrams that will tell you about what the system should do. They provide a generic overview and what they do not provide too much detail, okay, because that's not the purpose of them. They are primarily used by team managers or project managers. The system requirements, however, are for developers, or like us, for software engineers. These are specific to people who understand from our discipline, and they can be more specific about stuff. They can affect a portion of the system, such as only the user interface, or just the database part, or a JSON traffic, a web service, or they can basically affect the overall system, such as the reliability, the security of the system, how fast the system functions, and so forth. So system requirements and user requirements are actually derived from one another. So user requirements are broken down into system requirements. Due to its detailed structure, the requirement documentation often serves as part of the contract in between the software engineer and the system buyer. So basically, once you have divided these requirements, you can put them into a specification folder, which it will help you to form up that what the system should do in detail. So many of the stakeholders might want to see these details, or in the next stage, how you're going to achieve these details, such as when you claim that you can support over 400 people in Moodle at the same time, so that people can do lectures. You have to have some backup for this, so that we will know that if 400 people connect to Moodle all at the same time, the services will not collapse. So these requirements, it is crucial to be defined in advance so that the system can continue to function. So let's go ahead and look into them in more detail. The user and system requirements may serve a dual function. So they have like two important missions. User requirements can be the basis for a bit of a contract before the contract is basically formed. You can use the user requirements to enlist like what the system should achieve so that you describe the system to an external entity, whether it's a stakeholder or someone else, in a better way. And the system requirements are actually whatever you define in the system requirements can be placed like literally copy paste into the contract itself. So this means that in order to generate the system requirements, you must first do the user requirements because as I said, essentially the system requirements themselves, they come from the user requirements. Here are some examples that you can see. The care system shall generate monthly management reports showing the cost of drugs prescribed by each clinic during that month. So whenever you define a user requirement for a system for generating reports within that month, and it will show the cost of drugs, it doesn't tell you how you're going to do it. It will tell you what it should do. This is a big difference that students get confused. Students assume that the requirements will tell you how to achieve to that requirement. This is not true. The requirements simply is focused on what the system should do, not how to achieve it, particularly the user requirements. When you break down this into system requirements, they will give you an analysis, a detail about this requirement. So whenever we generate 5 system requirements, they actually come from this specific user requirements. And every one of them is basically breaks down the main user requirement into multiple system requirements. So for example, a report shall be created for each clinic and shall list the individual names, total number of prescriptions, the number of doses, and the total cost of the drug. You see now that we know that there is a report that will be generated, but we didn't know what the report included in the user requirement. When we generate the system requirement, now we roughly have a good idea what the report will include. It will include the drug name, the total number of prescriptions, the number of doses, and also the cost of the drug. So you now know what database values or what persistency you require from this. And every single one of these, if you read them, you will see that it will give you some information that is roughly defined in the user requirements, and it will make it more specific, such as it will generate the report for printing after 5:30 on the last working day of the month. So every last day of the month will basically generate you this report, and you know this. So in short, what I'm trying to say is user requirements essentially generate system requirements. And user requirements are particularly used by the managers, the team leaders. They also used by contractors because basically they are the basis of this. But then again, the system requirements are very useful to developers. They are the people who are developing the system. They can also be used to the end user because they are the one using the system. When you look at these requirements and basically if a user of the systems know that at the end of the month at 5:30 there will be a report generated, they can use that information to print it at the end of every month to keep the track. So it is also useful to the end user itself. So what is the difference between user and system requirements? The user requirements are not concerned with how the system should be implemented, something I already mentioned. They can be used to describe the system to managers. The system requirements are concerned with how these requirements will be supported. So just as I mentioned before, these are very abstract definitions in here. It doesn't tell you where when you break down it, you now roughly have an idea of how to achieve that because it details it. So the big difference here is that if you have an idea of how to reach that outcome, it gives you some detail about the requirements itself, then it is a system requirement. If it is only drawing a general picture and it needs to be broken down into several other requirements in order to understand what should be done, then it is a user requirement. So this is the main difference between user and system requirements. Before I continue further, do you have any questions about the requirements? Hello, are you there? Can anybody hear me?
No question, sir.
Okay. All right then. So what I'm gonna do in this one is that when I talk about the contracts, they are also serving you as the basis for the end user agreement. This end user agreement that we basically uh, exist in every single software that you use right now, even into the mobile platform. And funny enough, you actually know what an end user agreement, but you never read it because you automatically say accept and go to the next screen. But by doing so, you basically agree on everything and go to the next screen to install the software. Now, when I say a contract in between the end user, it doesn't mean that you have to sign it. By just clicking on here and going to the next screen, you actually agreeing to that contract. Now, this contract is basically formed by forming the user and system requirements themselves. So if you go up, we mentioned about the user requirements being the base and the system requirements making the contract itself. So essentially, your system requirements are actually placed in that contract. Somehow they exist there so that they define your limitations. Remember, one of the traps that students often fall is that they automatically assume requirements are only about what the system should do. No, that's not true. Anything that system limits you, the user or the actual functionality of the system is also a requirement. So basically, if it's in the contract that tells you that you cannot copy this software to another machine, or you cannot, use the copyrighted images or tools or whatsoever inside the software, or you are not allowed to reach to the source code of the program, and those are also requirements for you to follow because they are put upon restrictions on you. Any kind of restrictions, limitations that is defined in the system can also be a requirement. So requirements are not only about what the system should do, whatever is being not allowed for you to do, or whatever restrictions put up there, limitations can also be a requirement. Now, requirements themselves are recognized differently in different process models. Many agile methods argue that producing detailed system requirements is a waste of time because agile nowadays want to focus on building a system quickly. So if I waste too much time on defining requirements, by the time that I finish this requirement, they will already change. Now, with the agile development, I agree to this 100%. Many of the agile approaches do not do an extensive requirements. They just rely on user stories and they focus on the task itself rather than keeping things on WIP. They want to focus on completing the task. So this is why they don't want to spend too much time on defining what these requirements are, because by the time that they agree on something, probably those requirements will change. However, this is not true for every single project. Many of the projects that we do today are very well established, and the requirements are unlikely to change. such as a very well-established stock control system or a healthcare system is very well established. There is not much room to be developed because it's already very well defined. How these things will work on, it's already defined. So what you need to do in there, that there should be some items going into the database. You will update the items, you will edit the items, you will basically show the items. Those four main functionalities are the key ones that you're going to support. Of course, this can be extended with join and other functionalities such as web services and so forth. But the key items, the key requirements there are unlikely to change. Not every single software project can be regarded as agile. Look at the traffic lights. Have you seen traffic lights being changed since you were born? Ever since that the traffic lights are invented, they only had three colors. And the mechanism that works, green, uh, red, and red and yellow, they have been the same for decades now. It is unlikely to change. In that regard, we cannot simply say that the requirements are a waste of time. They are actually very well established, and you can move into the next page. You know how the system would function, you know how it will behave. There's a very well established system there. You just want to do the requirements for additional purposes. So yes, the agile embraces the idea that requirements basically is a waste of time. So do not spend too much time on it, but it also should clearly indicate that not every project can be agile. All right. Agile usually refers to projects that will be supported by the customer involvement. To summarize user and system requirements, we can say that user requirements are written with a natural language. So many of the details are left there to be abstract. The keyword you should always use when the user requirements are mentioned is the natural language. They could also be represented with diagrams or user stories. For the system requirements, this is no longer true. The natural language become a technical language now. It enlists the detailed descriptions of the system. At the end of the system requirements, actually, a functional specification document is released, and these specification documents serve as a base for design and development. So this is actually when design and development is started. By completing the system requirements, you can start design and development. Of course, many activities take this as concurrent because they skip the requirements. But in a hierarchy, technically, you need to release a functional specification in order to go to the next stage of development and design. I am approaching to my 40 minutes limit. Before I move on to functional and non-functional requirements, do you want to have a discussion? We still have 7 minutes, so if you want to ask anything about functional or non-functional, user and system requirements, I can listen. No one. Wow. Are these lectures a waste of time? I started to think like everything is so clear and I'm just wasting my time. Yes, Rawant. Yes, Rawant, you can talk. I unmuted you. He has probably a problem with his computer or something. I'm not quite sure. Anyone else who wants to ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Nah,
I've got a question, sir.
tell me again.
Yes, sir. So basically about the system requirements is for the developers only, right? Not the managers.
It's not only for developer, end users can also use system requirements. Like I just told you, if you go up, actually when you agreed to this agreement, you probably never read it. But when you agree to it, you are agreeing to certain terms in here for the contract. And if you go up, we already mentioned that that contract is actually developed by the system requirements, because the system requirements are the basis for the contract itself. You see, it is the basis. So when I say the contract, I mean the end user agreement, which you all press on agree, never read it, and press on the next stage. That is called the user agreement. And when you agree to this, you are agreeing to do all system requirements, actually, at least the ones that are mentioned in here. Hence, it is concerning you. It is not only for developer, it is also for the user. If you go up, here I mention which requirement address to which people. User requirements are the client managers, system end users, client engineers, and so forth. And the system requirements also include the end users, the architects, and developers. Here you won't find the developers because the developer themselves are specifically using the system requirements. That is very true. But it's not only for the developers. The end user can also use system requirements. Is that clear?
Yes, it's clear. Then, then on the agile development, the system we are less, right. Requirements are less on agile development.
They are seen as a waste of time because in an agile development approach, the requirements change so fast that it is hard to keep up. So what they do is that in a fast developing environment, they rely on the user stories, the user feedback. So when you release a software, you rely on feedback on it. Okay, that is how we develop the software. An agile approach includes, for example, the development of mobile applications. Okay, have you ever
Okay.
developed a mobile application before?
Uh, Not yet say. The project is my first. This project will be my first.
Okay, if you're gonna develop a mobile application in the future, know that wasting too much time on the requirements documentation is not a very good idea. Instead, you're gonna focus on building up the software, and when you get feedback from the user, you have to update it to a version that the user wants. So being in contact with the user is the key there. Right, I'm gonna stop in here and go back to a big blue button and invite you again because I am now at the end of my 40-minute session and I'll see you guys in the next half. So let's go back to Moodle and I'll send you an invitation. Take care.